Thanks very much to the chairman and to the International Coffee Organisation for inviting me to speak here today. As we know, the bad news is that this is the last presentation of the day. The good news is that if anybody would like to continue the discussion, I would be more than happy to take question and answers in a local hostelry. As you can see today, the intention and the request from the ICO is that I talk about the Asian coffee market and trends in both production and consumption. So I'll try to keep things as brief as possible so that we have time to ask questions at the end, both of myself and Edward. Just looking at a brief overview, what I'd like to do first of all is just to think about Asian coffee production in a global context and just look at a bird's eye view of how Asian production has changed over the last 10 or 20 years. I don't think it's going to come as a surprise to many of you to learn that Vietnam is really the biggest driver of growth in Asian production. So as a result, I would like to talk a little bit about my experiences in Vietnam, the current crop prospects and potential for the future. I'd like to consider the question as to whether China really is the next big thing for coffee consumption, and potentially learn some of the lessons that we have from the experiences of Japan over recent years. And finally, to talk a little bit about what I consider to be the real trend in Asian consumption growth, and rather less the traditional markets such as Japan and South Korea, but really the producer-consumer bloc. We've heard a lot about that already today, but I'd like to finish by just thinking a little bit more about those trends in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Thailand, and in the Philippines. So starting with production and looking at the global context, first of all, and taking some of the USDA's data as a starting point, we've seen something like a 60 million bag increase in global coffee production over the last 20 or indeed 23 years. If we look at the origins of that increase, we can see straight away that African production has actually dropped over the period, and Latin American production is at best stable. So in fact, all of the growth that we've actually seen in coffee production over that period of time has come from both South America and Asia. In absolute terms, I think South American production, led very much by Brazil, has increased by something like 25 to 30 million bags over the period. Asian production, from a smaller base, has actually increased by 30 to 35 million bags over the same period. So over the last 25 years, by far and away the biggest growth in global coffee production, either in absolute terms or in percentage terms, has come from Asia. If we split production and consider Arabica and Robusta separately, again, we can see very clearly that the biggest production growth in the Arabica segment, again, has come in South America. That is almost entirely from gains in Brazilian Arabica production. Within Asia, production remains relatively small. We have a little bit of Arabica production in Vietnam, we have a little bit of production in Indonesia, we grow a little bit of Arabica coffee in Papua New Guinea. However, the real growth in Asian production, and again, I don't think this will be of any surprise to many people in the room, is on the Robusta side. I've deliberately left the scale on the two charts at the same levels. You can see previously Arabica production standing at something around 90 million bags. At present, Robusta has increased to 65 million bags in 2013-14, and as I said, almost all of that growth has come once again from two places. Growth in Brazilian Conilon production, but by far more impressively, growth in Asian Robusta production. And that's really where I want to focus. Where have we seen that growth in Asian Robusta production? Well, as I said originally, it's almost all from Vietnam. Over the last 20-25 years, we've seen a little bit of growth in Indian Robusta production. We've seen a little bit of growth in the other Asian Robusta producers. And in fact, in Indonesia, we appear to have seen what is a very impressive percentage return, with production almost doubling over the last 25 years. But actually, in Vietnam, we've gone from less than 1 million bags of coffee 25 years ago to what I believe will approach a little bit more than the USDA's forecast of 28 million bags in the current season. So we've seen phenomenal production growth in Vietnam. And what I'd like to do at this stage, just to talk a little bit about the current crop and then talk about the reasons for that growth and my view on whether that is likely to continue going forward. So starting with the current crop, we've recently received February exports and Ho Chi Minh stock availability. So far through to the end of February, flows in Vietnam are still running slightly below year-ago levels. But at the same time, the crop this year was running a little bit later than a year ago, and I would fully expect that over the course of March and April those flows increase and that we follow a much more similar path to the record crop in 2011-12. I'd also like to point out, using this methodology, we're really looking at the amount of coffee that is commercialised by Vietnam, how much is exported, how much is consumed locally, and also how much changes in terms of the stocks held at the port in Ho Chi Minh City. If you look at the 2012-13 season, I actually believe that there was an increase in stock held upcountry by farmers and local traders, such that the 2012-13 statistics actually understate total production. So actually it appears that we've jumped forward in the last 2 or 3 years from production in the 15 or 17 to 20 million bag range from most of 2007 to 2010 up to the 25 and potentially 30 million bag level in the last couple of years. I was in Vietnam this summer. It was amazing to me to see how much new productive area there is in Vietnam. Normally speaking, as you drive around Dak Lak or Lam Dong, you see coffee almost everywhere. But what was incredible this year is that as you move between the provinces, you actually see a lot of the area by the sides of the road cut and new coffee, young coffee growing. For anybody that thinks that we have already plateaued, I would say that I've seen an awful lot of coffee that is still in the seedling form, in the 2 or 3 year old form, potentially yet to produce or still in the very, very earliest phases of production. So in my view, the question of whether we will see the first 30 million bag crop from Vietnam is really a question of if and when rather than if. Some of the other experiences that I can share from Vietnam: huge volumes of seedling sales. So this was at the bottom right of the screen, one of the seedling factories that we saw in Vietnam. It was actually quite incredible to see a full seedling factory. Most of the time these establishments were empty. Farmers were coming in, loading up trucks, taking trucks out to plant coffee. I started the unofficial seedling distributor iPhone index this year. Clearly there is a lot of money to be made distributing seedlings. The business is very, very good. Even when we talk to farmers about the potential impacts of the low prices that we were seeing, or the relatively low prices that we were seeing in July and August of this year, they were extremely optimistic about future prospects, continuing to plant new coffee areas, so on and so forth. So as I say, my belief is that the trend in Vietnam coffee production will continue and will remain very, very strong. Why? Well, I often say when I'm asked to speak on either cocoa or coffee that price is the best fertilizer. Now, looking at cost of production in Vietnam, I would come to an estimate of direct costs of production, looking at fertilizer, irrigation and harvesting, at something around the 20,000 Vietnamese dong area. That equates to somewhere around $1,000 per metric ton. Now, of course, that's not including the costs, for example, of the farmer's time. It's not necessarily including all of the costs that the farmer faces, but it seems very clear that the farmer in Vietnam is making good money at between 25 or 30,000 Vietnamese dong per kilo. And certainly the feedback that we had when speaking to fertilizer salesmen, to local traders, and to the farmers alike was that at a Robusta price in excess of 30,000 dong, there was a great deal of interest in Vietnam in growing additional coffee, so on and so forth. So I think that really is what explains what we've seen on the slide previously in terms of the new planted areas, and what we saw on the slide before that in terms of the expansion of production and the ongoing increased trend. And finally, just looking at that price over the years, if I take the direct cost of production at 20,000 Vietnamese dong, and I consider a realistic all-in cost of production at perhaps 25 to 30,000 Vietnamese dong, again, you can really see why production in Vietnam is so strong. For most of the last 5 or 6 years, we've been trading well above that level. In fact, when we got down to 30,000 dong in August and September of this year, that was around about the time that I visited, and as you could see, the farmers were still continuing to invest in additional seedling, additional area expansion. Moving on to the question of consumption, I think since I started in coffee in 2003, I've always been told that China will be the next big thing in terms of driving consumption growth. And I think there are both positives and, let's say, negatives or truths and half-truths to that message. I think China will ultimately be the next big thing in terms of coffee consumption. You can see from publicly listed companies' strategies, from their annual reports, there is an awful lot of investment going on at the moment to capitalise on a growing Chinese market. And if we look at import data, you can also see that Chinese imports of coffee are beginning to accelerate. From less than 500,000 bags for most of the first half of the noughties, surpassing the million bag mark in 2012-13 for the first time, with an expected import level of almost 1.5 million bags in 2013-14. However, if we look at the exports of Chinese coffee, they actually mirror almost exactly the growth in imports to date. So what does that tell us? Well, consumption in China may well be growing at a rapid rate. It's coming from a low base, but at the moment, Chinese production appears to be growing at the same sort of rate as consumption. And actually, when you look at some of the strategies in place from some of the multinationals, they are not just geared to selling more coffee to Chinese consumers, they are also geared to producing more coffee within China to feed that supply chain. As I say, so far, China has remained more or less a zero-sum game in terms of coffee trade flows. Imports and exports have roughly offset over the last decade. I actually like to think about China as we think about Japan. And for those of you that may be struggling to see the bottom of the slide here, we're looking at Japanese coffee consumption over the last 60 years. So starting from a base of almost zero in 1950 and very, very low consumption even into the 60s, consumption of coffee in Japan began to accelerate during the 70s and 80s, and Japan began that transition from a tea-drinking nation to what has become, actually, I think, the fourth single biggest consumer of coffee globally and the third biggest importing nation of coffee. But there is something of an S-curve to this history. The question that I would ask is, at what stage or what is the comparison to the current state of Chinese coffee consumption? And I would rather guess that we're somewhere in between 1960 and 1970. We're beginning to accelerate, but actually the real growth will come a little bit further forward than perhaps many people realise. At the moment, large percentage notional increases year on year in Chinese consumption will still have relatively limited absolute effects on global demand, not least because, as we described before, China is still in an apparent upwards trend in local production. So where is the real story in Asian coffee consumption? Well, actually, I look at Japan and I look at South Korea. As I say, Japan on its own is the fourth single biggest consumer of coffee in the world. But when I look at consumption over the last 10, 12 years, there is only a very small uptrend in consumption in place. It's relatively steady. Consumption is increasing a little bit year on year. I think a lot of that is driven by increasing consumption in South Korea. But actually, over the last 10 to 12 years, I can only find an extra million bags or so of absolute coffee consumption, something like 100,000 bags of coffee annually. So I don't think, very similar to the story in Europe, I don't think that we can expect to see big growth from the traditional markets of Asia. What fascinates me and gets me particularly excited as a coffee analyst is the growth in what I would call the producer consumers. So here we look at consumption growth, and I do apologise for the slide, that should say world coffee consumption. The growth in consumption in those Asian producer consumers, so Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Thailand, the Philippines, and last but not least China. And when we look at growth in those countries, you go back to 1990 or 1995, at that point total consumption in these countries was less than half of current consumption in Japan and South Korea. Over the space of the last 10 or 15 years, we've actually got to the stage where we're approaching having double the consumption in these producer consumers than we see in Japan and South Korea combined. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the real force not only of coffee consumption in Asia, but actually the real driver of global coffee consumption. The rapid growth that we're seeing is resulting in annual increments of almost 1 million bags of demand being added every single year from this producer-consumer block. So in conclusion, the world market is increasingly dependent upon Asian production, and particularly for Robusta coffee. As many of the speakers have already alluded to, Vietnam alone accounts to close to 60% of Robusta exports. If you look at Vietnam and Indonesia combined, that stands at almost 75%. So from the sort of risk parameter that we've been discussing a lot during the day, we have an enormous concentration risk within Southeast Asia in terms of Robusta coffee production in particular. We are particularly exposed to any sort of weather problem. In my view, China is still at the very early stage and on the first upwards part of that consumption revolution. We will eventually get there, but it may be something that takes place over 30 to 40 years rather than 5 to 10 years. However, there is a real story in Asian consumption, and that is the rise of these producer consumers, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand and the Philippines in particular, who are growing at a staggering rate, something like 8% a year, adding more than 1 million bags annually to global demand. Total consumption in that block is now almost double of that of Japan and South Korea. However, and luckily, Vietnam is still expanding. Prices are good, farmers are responding, price is indeed the best fertiliser, the trend is up, and I, as I said, would expect to see a 30 million bag crop in the next year or two given good weather. But as I said, that is lucky because Vietnam is the growing producer in the area, and that is certainly needed just to feed local growth in the region. So at that stage, I'll return to the podium and offer questions.